I think in the interest of time, we'll begin and people will join as and when. So, if you can, we've got the setup like a Zoom call rather than a webinar. I think it's nice for the group if everyone can see each other's face rather than looking at blank screens. So, if you don't mind and you're respectable, please to turn your camera on. It would be lovely to see your face. So, just to begin, good morning and good evening to those of you who are joining us from the United States. Welcome to this special discussion on Joel Witt's new book, Fallout, the Inside Story of America's Failure to Disarm North Korea. My name is Shata Shetty. I'm the Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network, or APLN. As many of you know, APLN is a Seoul-based organization of over 175 former and serving political, military, and diplomatic leaders from across 25 countries in the region, working to address security challenges with a particular focus on reducing nuclear risks. Uh, the Korean Peninsula is a nuclear challenge that's central to our mission. It sits at the heart of the security dynamics that we work on every day. And our network includes former and serving officials from South Korea, Japan, and China with direct experience in DPRK negotiations. This is a topic that we care about deeply. And we believe that informed dialogue is more important now more than ever. That's why we're delighted to be co-hosting this event, partnering with the Institute of North Korean Studies at Yonsei University and the Korea Peace Forum to bring you today's discussion. Joel Witt's book could not be more timely, with renewed speculation of a possible Trump-Kim summit and ongoing debates of what a realistic approach to North Korea's nuclear arsenal might look like. The lessons of past diplomatic efforts have never been more relevant. Fallout gives us the definitive insider account of how 6 American presidents grappled and ultimately failed to halt Pyongyang's march towards the nuclear arsenal. And it offers essential insights for anyone trying to understand where we go from here. So, a quick few housekeeping notes before we begin. This is an open, off-the-record event. No Chatham House rules apply. We will also be recording the session and uploading it to our YouTube channel. We encourage you to submit questions during the discussion by raising your hand or using the chat function, and we will open the floor to a broader audience Q&A after the moderated discussion. And with that, I'm pleased to hand over to our moderator, Michelle Lee. Michelle is the Tokyo and Seoul bureau chief for the Washington Post, covering Japan and Korea and the Korean Peninsula. She's one of the leading journalists reporting on Northeast Asian security today, and we're very grateful to have her guiding today's conversation. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Shata. And just to clarify, this is an on-the-record event.
Yes.
Open on-the-record event. Okay, great.
On the record,
Thank
yeah.
you. Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle Yehi Lee. I am the Tokyo Seoul bureau chief at the Washington Post. I cover Japan and the Korean Peninsula. And I want to thank the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for having me here today. I'm very honored to be able to speak with Joel and get to hear from the rest of you and your questions. So first, I want to introduce Joel. Joel S. Witt is a distinguished fellow in Asian and security studies at the Stimson Center and one of the foremost experts on U.S.-North Korea relations. As a U.S. State Department official, he helped negotiate the 1994 U.S. DPRK Agreed Framework and subsequently oversaw its implementation, holding extensive talks with North Korean officials, including from the military and nuclear establishments, until he left the government in 2002. He is a co-founder of 38 North, the leading analytical website on North Korea, and co-author of Going Critical, the First North Korean Nuclear Crisis. His new book, Fallout, the Inside Story of America's Failure to Disarm North Korea, published by Yale University Press, draws on more than 300 interviews to chronicle how 6 American presidents approached and ultimately failed to halt North Korea's nuclear weapons program. So thank you, Joel. It's great to be with you.
I'm very happy to be here.
I really enjoyed this book. You see, I made lots of
Right.
notes here. And I really enjoyed how you brought us into these negotiating rooms, sharing your personal experience with North Koreans and giving these personal insights and insider anecdotes that I really thought brought the book to life. I wanted to start with just a general question, which is what made you want to write this book, and how did you come to the decision to focus the vast majority of your book on the Obama and Trump years?
Well, I've been working on the issue of North Korea's nuclear weapons program for 30 years. And a large part of that was at the US State Department, working on the agreed framework and then trying to implement that agreement. But the rest of the time was, I was in Washington, D.C., I wasn't in the US government, but I was following events closely. And for all those years, I was meeting regularly with North Korean government officials and running a number of Track 2 meetings. And so based on all that experience, I was really unhappy with the dominant narratives about US North Korean relations that you would find in the United States and in Northeast Asia. And so I thought, well, gee, I have all this experience. I know all the people involved, not just Americans, but South Koreans, Chinese, Japanese, and others. So I really want to put down on paper what's been happening. What is the real story here? And on top of that, I've always wanted to be a historian. And I realize that a lot of history is not to be found in archives. It's to be found in talking to the people who participated in events. And that's why I did so many interviews. So all of that led to me working on this book. And as I said earlier to some of you who were on the call, I started out wanting to write a book about the Obama administration because no one had done that yet. And by the time I got through with the research and I was ready to write, we were into the Trump administration. And I thought, well, gee, no one's going to want to read a book about the Obama administration and not the Trump administration. So I had to continue my research and writing. And, it took me 6 years to finish the whole project, but I think it was definitely worthwhile to also include President Trump.
Yeah, absolutely worthwhile. I was really amazed at the amount of research and interviews that went into this book. I like to flip back and forth between the footnotes just to see where the information's from, and it was interview after interview after interview. Tell us a little bit about your process. How did you manage this extraordinary amount of research and just information from interviews over 6 years to put together this book?
Uh, well, I'm not quite sure, but thinking back on it, the pieces seem to fall in place as I talked to more and more people. And of course, I used publicly available documents and newspaper accounts, but a lot of them were not accurate. So the pieces seemed to fall into place as I did more and more interviews. And I know that kind of research can be risky because people's memories are not always that good. But what I was finding was that, I would be able to confirm events through multiple interviews. And that's what allowed me to get inside the room of a lot of these meetings, government meetings in particular, but also, my own meetings with the North Koreans. I had transcripts of those. So I guess it's, it maybe I was lucky, but everything seemed to fit together as I moved from, every event in each administration. All the pieces seemed to fit together to create this narrative that it's not just a boring academic narrative, pardon me for saying that, anyone who's an academic out there, but really giving a hands-on feel for the people involved, ranging from world leaders to people like me.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the content of the book. You know, an important part of that beginning part of the narrative in your book is the 1994 agreed framework and the Bush administration's decision to abandon it. Tell us about the administration's legacy on the North Korea issue and particularly around that decision with the agreed framework.
Well, the Bush administration, I think, was dysfunctional in terms of how it dealt with North Korea. And it was dysfunctional because, half of the administration wanted to get rid of the agreed framework, the 1994 agreement, and another half wanted to keep it. And I think that explained a lot of the initial dysfunction in the administration. But the part that wanted to get rid of it obviously won out. And the Bush administration took a series of steps that resulted in its collapse, the agreement's collapse. Now, the issue then becomes, well, people say to me, well, what else could the Bush administration have done? The North Koreans were cheating. We knew that at the end of the Clinton administration that they were conducting activities they shouldn't have been conducting, the uranium enrichment activities. We knew that was happening. And, so the knee-jerk reaction to that is, oh, they're cheating, let's get out of this agreement. Well, what they should have done and what the Clinton administration was prepared to do, and if Al Gore had won the election, he would have done, was to go to the North Koreans and use the leverage of the agreed framework to end the North Korean violations of the deal. We were prepared to do that. A Gore administration would have been prepared to do that. And even after the agreed framework was on the verge of collapse, even after the US envoy, Jim Kelly, had visited Pyongyang and, had left there in an unsuccessful mission to convince the North Koreans to stop cheating, the North Koreans reached out to the White House through Don Oberdorfer and Don Gregg. Don Oberdorfer, the Washington Post reporter, and Don Gregg, the former US ambassador to South Korea. They sent a message to the White House. And they brought a message to the White House. The North Koreans sent one through them, Kim Jong-il. And he said, we want to negotiate. We want to fix this problem. And the White House said, nope, we don't negotiate with evil, essentially. And that was the end of the deal. And what's even worse is the Bush administration had no plan to deal with the collapse of the agreed framework. And subsequently, in the second term, they tried to reconstitute at least parts of the agreed framework, not the whole agreement, and didn't really succeed.
Yeah, they didn't have much time at that point either. So then the Obama administration comes in, and at the beginning of Obama's time in office, North Korea was barely able to develop one nuclear weapon, but now has dozens of nuclear warheads and an arsenal of long-range missiles that could strike anywhere in the continental US. And you write that this was preventable. The book offers quite a searing indictment of Obama's strategic patience policy, and now it makes sense why initially you started off with an Obama book, then it expanded. You wrote, quote, in fact, the Obama administration had decided to deal with North Korea by not dealing with North Korea. It was a policy of paralysis cloaked in a virtuous posture of patience, unquote. Tell us about the key decisions by the Obama administration and this strategic patience policy that enabled North Korea's nuclear program rather than curbing it.
Well, strategic patience was based on the assumption that we could increase pressure on North Korea and they would eventually come back to the negotiating table and reach a deal. That was essentially the thrust of the policy. The problem was we didn't increase pressure on North Korea. The sanctions that were enacted for most of the administration were not extensive at all. They were very limited. And, we weren't really enthusiastic about getting back to the negotiating table. So what you had was a policy that was essentially on autopilot for most of the administration. Now, there is one exception, of course, and people know about the 2012 Leap Day deal. And, the Obama administration reached this deal knowing full well that it didn't have a deal, that the North Koreans, in fact, had not agreed to a key demand by the Americans, which was to stop their space launch program, which involved technology that could be used for ballistic missiles. North Koreans never agreed to that in the Leap Day negotiations, but we basically presented the deal as a done deal. It quickly collapsed, and the Obama administration tried to salvage the deal. There were 2 secret missions to North Korea in the months after the deal was reached and after the deal collapsed. 2 secret missions that tried to salvage the deal, but they were mishandled because the people on the secret missions, these were all CIA people, they basically met with the North Korean officials and said, it's our way or the highway. Either you agree to what we want or we're going to increase pressure on you. And the North Koreans didn't bite. So the deal couldn't be salvaged. And the collapse of the deal set up the second term of the Obama administration. And one White House official told me the attitude in the second term was, and pardon my English, we're not going to deal with those assholes anymore. And that was essentially it for the second term. The problem is that Kim Jong-un took over, and he had a very different approach to developing weapons of mass destruction. So the North Korean programs took off, and he started to make rapid progress. In fact, the progress was so rapid that in 2014, President Obama ordered the Pentagon to come up with a plan to destroy North Korea's missiles before they could leave the ground. And the Pentagon came back and said, basically, we can't guarantee that.
Already at that point, they were advancing in their program. In your book, you also talk about the North Korean perspective of strategic patience. During those Obama years, the North Koreans were willing to negotiate with the U.S. and wanted Obama to take them seriously, right? You wrote about how they were puzzled by this strategic patience policy.
Yeah, and I can remember a Track 2 meeting I was in with Chae Sun-hee and a number of other senior North Korean officials. Chae Sun-hee, who's now the North Korean foreign minister. And they were puzzled by strategic patience. And they thought there was a hidden objective there, which was to use North Korea's nuclear and missile program as an excuse to increase our presence in Northeast Asia and to increase pressure on the Chinese. And we tried to convince her, no, the US government isn't that smart. Strategic patience was based on the idea, and this was a continuing issue throughout successive American administrations. And the issue is, whose side is time on? The North Koreans or the United States? And the Obama administration thought time was on the United States' side. The North Koreans, on the other hand, kept saying repeatedly, time is on their side. And they were right.
How much of the US dealing with North Korea over the years can be attributed to that, like, what you called the ossified bureaucracy, or I guess Susan Rice called ossified bureaucracy, sort of this bureaucratic inertia to go above and beyond to try to tackle the North Korean problem versus just sort of manage it, you know?
Well, there are a number of explanations here. There's the big picture explanation of why US policy failed for many years. And the big picture explanation is we overestimated our ability to deal with North Korea, to change what it thought its national interests were. And we underestimated how much they would resist that. And a lot of that had to do with, we really didn't understand the North Koreans. And this is a problem that, as everyone knows, occurs time and time again with US foreign policy. You can go back to Vietnam, you can fast forward to Iraq, you can fast forward even more to Afghanistan. So that's the big picture problem. When you talk about ossified bureaucracy, what I felt, certainly when I was in the Clinton administration and from doing all this research on Obama and Trump, is that the president sets the direction. The White House sets the direction. So in the case of the Obama administration, Susan Rice said the bureaucracy was ossified by the time she became national security advisor. And it was ossified because strategic patience had become the guiding principle. And everyone was following that, so much that when the bureaucracy was asked by the White House near the end of the administration, what are the alternatives? The bureaucracy couldn't come up really with any big alternatives. And certainly no one dared to talk about holding a summit with Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, well, and then Trump comes in, right? And the president does decide that this is something he wants to tackle himself. And he comes in with this new approach to deal with Kim Jong-un directly. And the letters begin, the bad ones, the good ones, the tweets begin. So we know what happened at Hanoi. You wrote that, quote, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that Kim wanted a deal, thought one was within reach, and was just as surprised as everyone else when the summit collapsed. And I think this is an important point because as Americans, we often view the Hanoi summit from Trump's perspective, like, what he was distracted by, what, the Cohen hearings or what he wanted. But it was interesting to read it from the Kim Jong-un perspective and what the discussions were behind the scenes. Tell us about the factors that Kim was weighing going into Hanoi, like pivoting from military to the civilian economy, that kind of stuff, and why Kim actually did want a deal going in.
Well, at least from my perspective, it was very clear, and it had become clear before Hanoi, way before Hanoi, that Kim wanted a deal. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of the big reasons that is missed by most analysts is that ever since his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un were in part motivated, their engagement policy was motivated by a desire to modernize North Korea's economy. And if you're driven by that desire, there are a number of things that you need to have happen. One of which is you'd like assistance from the West. Another one is you need to switch resources from your enormous military burden to your civilian economy. And you can see this with every successive North Korean leader. And in fact, before Hanoi, Kim Jong-un was talking in public and to his people, not just for foreign audiences, but to his people about the need to switch gears, the need to step up modernization of their economy, and even hinting at, switching some of the defense industries from building weapons to civilian pursuits. So all of that, is a very important factor. On top of that, every one of the North Korean leaders has been motivated by geopolitics and the need to engage the United States because their former close allies, the Soviet Union and China, had started, Soviet Union collapsed, obviously, and China had already started to reach out to South Korea in the early 1990s. And so every leader looked for an alternative, and the United States was that alternative. So, those are the big factors motivating Kim. But, if you look at the record of all his meetings with South Koreans, with President Moon, with special envoys from South Korea, with Mike Pompeo, if you look at all these meetings, if you look at the correspondence, you can see that he was serious. And he was serious about moving down the road towards denuclearization. And, to the last point I want to make is that here's Kim Jong-un. He's flying off to meet Donald Trump in Hanoi. His trip is being trumpeted to his domestic audiences. He's not going there to fake out Donald Trump. He's going there to reach a deal. And in fact, one of the senior White House officials who was with Trump said to me, it was about as CNN as it gets, for the North Korean media covering Hanoi. So it was all a big embarrassment for Kim, although he tried to hide it.
You think Trump took that seriousness seriously? Like, do you think he had recognized all those stakes for Kim and what it could mean if the Hanoi summit did fall apart?
That's a good question. Leaving aside why it collapsed, there's an interesting anecdote that I heard from many South Korean officials. When Trump, when the summit had collapsed, Trump walked out. He had his press conference. He got on Air Force One. And, Air Force One took off. And the first person Trump called was President Moon. And he said to President Moon, not once, but 7 times, get in touch with Kim Jong-un and see how he's feeling. Now, I'm not sure what that means exactly, but to me, it says Trump may have had some doubts about walking out. And he may also have been concerned that walking out had really made Kim angry and would really damage their relationship.
There are a lot of what ifs about the Hanoi summit in hindsight. And one of those what ifs is, what if Trump had a little more patience or stuck around a little bit longer instead of calling it so early in the day? But President Trump is back in office, and we still have, just under 3 years left in Trump's second term. For the U.S. side, what are the lessons that we could take away from U.S.-North Korea relations under Trump 1 that can be applied in Trump 2?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And, you know, let me talk a little bit about where I am in terms of another summit. I have some serious doubts about whether there should be another summit. And part of that is because of President Trump. So if you want to learn lessons from the first term, you know, the first term, I view President Trump's policies as fairly successful. You know, he had the right approach, symmetry. It didn't appear this way, but inside the administration, after the Singapore summit, they had an approach that I think was the right approach. It was a phased approach to denuclearization. That was the result of a special envoy, Steve Biegun, who worked with Mike Pompeo, and they worked with Trump. So they were steering Trump in the right direction. The problem with the second term is I don't think there's anyone who's going to steer Trump in the right direction. There's no one like Steve Biegun. I don't think Marco Rubio is going to really take the place of Mike Pompeo on North Korea. And besides that, Trump has even said publicly, who knows Kim Jong-un better than I do? So he's going to be unsteered. And right away, to me, that's a negative thing. You know, who knows what's going to happen in a summit with Kim Jong-un if Trump thinks he knows what to do and is still basing his experience on 2019. So what I would say, if you want to have a successful summit, if the United States wants to have a successful summit, it really needs to have people advising Trump who know what the situation is today, know how it's changed since 2019, and it's changed dramatically. And we can get into the North Korean side of things, but their policies have changed dramatically. And, you know, it's just not the same as 2019.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to bring it to today and discuss just that. After I have a couple more questions, I'll open it up to questions from the audience, and you can use the chat function to start putting in questions you have for Joel, and I will read them. And I see Professor Chejonggun in this room. I'm sure he has some thoughts and questions as well. So actually today, North Korea published its report from the Ninth Party Congress, and it doubles down on the North Korean stance now that its status as a nuclear power is irreversible and permanent. But the North Koreans again left some room open for negotiation with the US if the US withdraws its hostile policy and acknowledges North Korea's status as a nuclear power. You know, Kim must have had a lot of lessons learned on his own too from Hanoi. I can only imagine how many times he's replayed it in his head. What do you make of the stance that North Korea has toward the U.S. today? You know, is diplomacy possible again with them? And if that's the case, how do we restart that? Because it's not just Trump wanting to meet with Kim Jong-un. Kim has to want to meet with Trump too. But Kim's calculations have changed since 2019. What do you make of the current prospects for restarting diplomatic talks with North Korea?
Well, yes, you know, and this is why you know, I sort of waver between thinking, well, gee, maybe there should be a summit, and gee, thinking that it would be a big mistake. And one of the reasons why I waver is, as I said a minute ago, North Korea is in a very different place now. And most of us who follow North Korea understand that. They're not interested in engagement in the way they were in the past. They have new allies, Russia, certainly Russia, and you know they've always had China. their nuclear and missile forces have grown. They're modernizing their conventional forces. Their level of hostility to South Korea has, reached new heights. And Kim is feeling empowered. On the domestic front, I think North Korea is doing okay. Its economy is doing okay. They haven't had any, problems with their harvest. And he's feeling like he's a player on the world stage now. This is all very different from 6 years ago or 7 years ago. So, sure, Kim might agree to have a summit. And I didn't read the report today. So, it sort of opens the door for a number of demands he might make. But, it's not going to be the same kind of meeting. He's going to be there to first demonstrate that he is a player on the world stage. And secondly, he may be there to get the US to, acknowledge him as a nuclear weapon state, and acknowledge North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. He may also be there under the rubric of peaceful coexistence to encourage Trump to diminish the American commitment to the alliance. Certainly, Trump might be interested. He might be open to canceling military exercises with South Korea. Trump might even be open to some troop withdrawals. So there are a lot of landmines here that Trump could step on, especially since he doesn't seem to think he needs any advice.
Yeah, and Trump would have to keep the promise of stopping the exercises with South Korea too. Big picture, do you think, are we past the point of pursuing denuclearization with North Korea? There are experts who are now arguing for shifting to arms control instead, and President Trump has a couple times called North Korea a nuclear state, though it's questionable whether to take that as a shift in U.S. policy, because Secretary of State Rubio has said the U.S. policy has not changed. But North Korea says it's never, ever, ever giving up its nuclear weapons, and all signs point to how serious they really mean that. Is denuclearization still possible? Is that what we should be going for?
Well, look, let me make one point that is, I think, true for most of the past 30 years. Denuclearization has been an objective, but it's always been an ultimate objective. And the first steps were always arms control. So when you say stop flight testing or stop nuclear testing, that's arms control. So that's number one. Number two, I think this is a litmus test. If the U.S. is considering negotiations with North Korea, we should be thinking about how to hold on to the ultimate objective without insisting that it be part of the talks. So outside of the meetings, we can say, look, what we're about is we want North Korea to eventually give up its nuclear weapons, but that's not going to happen overnight. And if the North Koreans say, gee, that's not good enough, then I don't think they're really serious about talks. If they ignore that and we just move into talks, then that's a positive sign. So, it's like, to me, having spent 15 years in the State Department, there's ways of saying things that allow you to continue to have your national objective without forcing your negotiating partner to agree to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. I have a billion more questions, but so do the audience. So I'm going to shift over to some of these in the chat. Michiru Nishida says no mention about Biden's approach, but could calibrated practical approach been successful if conditions were right? Would it still be useful now? I kind of skipped over the Biden years because nothing happened during
Nothing
Biden
happened,
years.
right?
But but here's the what do you think about this question?
I'm sorry, repeat the second part
Oh,
of it.
could calibrated practical approach been successful if conditions were right? Would it still be useful now?
You mean under the Biden administration?
Yes, I think that's what, yeah.
Well, that's a good question. And I don't know for sure. All I know is that, the North Korean shift away from engagement really accelerated when the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. And it's geopolitics again. The North Koreans saw that the US, was a retreating world power. It wasn't what it used to be. So, whether there were any dying embers that could have reignited negotiations, hard for me to say. But, the bottom line is the Biden administration really had zero interest in talking to the North Koreans.
Yeah. In fact, they were very much more hardline. We have another question from Cheon Jung. Unlike President Moon, who was quite active, current President Lee in South Korea seems to be relatively quiet about North Korea. Why do you think such a difference between the two liberals emerged?
Well, to me, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, the current South Korean government is dealing with a very different situation from what President Moon had to deal with. I mean, as far as I can tell, the North Koreans have almost zero interest in talking to the current South Korean government. When President Moon was in office, the first year was rocky, of course. All the threats that were being traded between the United States and North Korea. But in fact, 2018, 2019, President Moon made significant progress through his summits with Kim Jong un. So, and, the North Koreans were open to that. They're not open to that today. And so I think the South Korean government is, being wise and not being too pushy about restarting talks.
President Lee is also, he doesn't seem to have that type of personal drive that President Moon had as well. I mean, talking about initiative from the leader level too. He's also just comes from a different background as President Moon did. So I see a difference in prioritization a little bit there too.
Yeah.
Um,
So let me just add one point. That's an excellent point because President Moon, when he was in the Blue House, as chief of staff, I forgot which this previous South Korean president. My mind is wandering. He was intimately involved in the preparations for summitry, so he was personally very committed to it. And I've got descriptions from other South Korean officials about President Moon being very involved in the preparations for his summits with Kim Jong un, including the formulation of positions for the comprehensive military agreement.
yeah. There was a follow-up question on the calibrated practical approach one. Is there uh, meaning, I assume, possibility for the second Trump administration to consider that calibrated practical approach?
Uh, the second Trump administration, yes. Look, the fact that denuclearization has receded even further in the future, we need to set different priorities. And I don't know what a calibrated practical approach means, but, a different priority is reducing tensions. And maybe that's, a calibrated practical approach could fit into that. So there might be some room for that. But once again, it's really hard to say what Kim Jong-un would be willing to do in a summit. And it's also really hard to say whether Donald Trump realizes denuclearization, it's not the same as in 2019.
Mohammed Johar has a
Yes,
question.
yes. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Joel Wit. I I haven't read your book. I haven't been able to get it, but I've read your interviews with some of your interviews with other organizations. And I really liked what you said in those interviews and just now too, because I think you are very respectful as well of North Korea's possibly legitimate security interests and concerns. I believe that any country has, and North Korea, like any other country, has legitimate security interests. And unfortunately, on the Korean Peninsula, we have boxed in North Korea to a situation where it has to rely on nuclear weapons for its survival. That's the way it is, you know. And therefore, denuclearization to me doesn't seem a practical option anymore. Arms control is what we should be going for. And in this respect, I read one of the reports on the Hanoi meeting, and it was said, and President Trump, of course, said that North Korea wanted all sanctions lifted. And North Korea Foreign Minister Ri came out with another press conference, and they rarely have this kind of press conferences. He came out with a press conference a few hours later saying, no, they only wanted 5 of the 11 sets of sanctions to be lifted. What is the real story? Thank you.
Well, the real story is that in the negotiations between President Trump and Kim Jong-un was demanding all sanctions should be lifted. He didn't get into the details. And he said he wanted that in return for the dismantlement of the Yongbyon nuclear facility. So if you read my book, that wasn't the end of the negotiation. It was the end of the negotiation between Trump and Kim Jong-un. But as Trump decided to walk out, there was another negotiation going on in a hallway near the holding rooms of the two delegations. And the other delegation was moving in the right direction in terms of, the dismantlement of Yongbyon and what was meant by that, and the demand for lifting of all sanctions, which the North Koreans started to clarify, including raising the possibility that, sanctions could be snapback sanctions. So that negotiation was going on in a hallway. Donald Trump walked past the people negotiating and out the door, and the Americans had to cut the talk short and walk out with him.
Great. Thank you. We have a question from Frank O'Donnell. How would you weigh the effects of China's policies in explaining the failure of North Korea to disarm vis-a-vis those of the U.S. policies you discuss?
Do we have another hour? That's going to be hard to answer. I mean, I think just as a general proposition, successive American administrations have believed that if China was really interested, it could force North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. And for a lot of reasons, China has never been willing to go down that path. And everyone knows what those reasons are. They're afraid of instability on their border, and they never really wanted to test that proposition. So, I think it was just another miscalculation in American policy to think that the Chinese could actually accomplish this for us. And, there are lots of different episodes where the Chinese were more cooperative than other episodes. But at the end of the day, they never really went as far as the Americans wanted them to go. So it was on us. It was on us. It wasn't the Chinese were going to save us from ourselves.
And the North Koreans also don't like the Chinese.
Well, that's another point. Even if the Chinese had said, okay, we're going to put a lot of pressure on the North Koreans, as much pressure as the Americans want. And Xi Jinping seemed to be leaning in that direction when he became president. He didn't really follow through in that. But even if the Chinese had put that pressure on the North Koreans, what makes everyone think that the North Koreans would have buckled under? That's not who they are.
We have a question from Daniel Lee. We briefly did talk about the inter-Korean relations, but he asks, in 2024, North Korea announced that they will no longer pursue reconciliation and peaceful reunification with South Korea. How will this shift affect any possible re-engagement by the US and South Korea with North Korea? Do you have any additional thoughts on the inter-Korean relations, Joel?
Not really. I just think everything that's going on between North and South Korea means that the United States is really going to have to step up to the plate, and South Korea is going to have to stay in the background. But one other point, if you want to think about ways that American policy might make progress with the North Koreans, one of the things you need to think about is, enlisting the acquiescence, the assistance even of Russia. And under the current circumstances, that may be very difficult. But the Russians are now key, I think, to any diplomacy that happens in Northeast Asia and on the Korean Peninsula.
I think that'll be the case even if, let's say, there is some sort of peace deal that is able to be reached in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, I know a lot of people, at least when the Russian-North Korean relationship started to take shape, thought it was just, it wasn't going to last if the war in Ukraine ended. Now I think almost every expert believes that this is a relationship that is durable, that is deep, and it will last.
Yeah, I've been hearing more of that as well. We have a couple more minutes left. I think the question about deterrence and denuclearization, I think we covered it pretty extensively at this point. I missed the question from Shata earlier. Your book has been described as essential reading for anyone in Washington trying to figure out what to do next. If you could sit down with the current U.S. negotiating team, what is the single most important lesson from your book that you would want them to take away?
Well, I think the single most important lesson is when our policies failed in the past, we didn't really understand North Korea's motivations, its interests, and what was possible. And I think we need to be able to do that today in order to structure an approach to a summit, if there is a summit. So, summitry would probably be the way to go. But, there are a lot of big ifs with that. For example, summitry would be a good idea if Donald Trump could be prepped beforehand to understand the current situation. Symmetry would be a good idea if Donald Trump had good advisors who understood North Korea. If Donald Trump could at least reach out to Russia and China beforehand to secure their acquiescence or support. And finally, if Donald Trump understood that denuclearization is way in the future, if at all, and the immediate priority is to lessen tensions on the peninsula. And I guess one more thing, Donald Trump needs to understand that, we shouldn't be moving away from our alliances with South Korea and Japan. So these are all big ifs. And, if someone could achieve all that, then that would be great.
A lot to achieve in less than 3 years now. I will ask one final question and then we'll wrap up there. You have worked with and dealt with North Koreans directly over the years, and I think a lot of sort of the shortfalls or shortcomings in U.S.-North Korea relations is that not many Americans have dealt directly with North Korea or even spoken to a North Korean. What misconceptions or misunderstandings do you think American diplomats sort of tend to have about dealings with North Koreans that you have seen not to be true, or that you want them to know, that the reality is different than what they might think?
That's a good question. And it's hard to generalize over 30 years of dealing with North Koreans, but I think a lot of the diplomats who've had hands-on experience with North Koreans, understand them pretty well. It's the people that diplomats have to answer to, the more senior people in U.S. administrations who can't be expected to understand North Koreans very well. And so the problem lies not with the diplomats who have hands-on experience with the North Koreans. The problem lies at a higher level in the U.S. government. And for that, I, in part, would blame the U.S. intelligence community, who they're really the go-to people in the U.S. government for more senior officials. And for years, they had no hands-on experience with North Koreans. And at least my experience was they were sort of stuck in the Cold War. And I think many of them are still stuck in the Cold War. That lens of dealing with the North Koreans. And I think that accounts for a lot of the mistakes that U.S. administrations have made.
Yeah, I think that's a very important note to end that I hope U.S. policymakers can take away. Thank you so much, Joel. I'm going to turn it over to Shata to wrap up the session.
Thank you so much, Joel and Michelle. That was truly a rich and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you, everyone who joined us today and contributed such excellent questions. It was super interesting. For those of you who haven't yet read Fallout, I highly recommend picking up a copy. It's published by Yale University Press. It's available now, and the Korean translation will be available very soon. I'd also like to thank our co-hosts, the Institute of North Korean Studies at Yonsei University and the Korea Peace Forum for making this event possible. If you'd like to stay in touch and up to date with APLN's work on Korean Peninsula dynamics, nuclear risk reduction in Asia Pacific security, please visit the APLN website at apln.network and do subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you again to Michelle and Joel. Thank you all for participating and for your engagement, and we look forward to engaging with you again. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Bye.
Thank you.